Good morning. My name is Carla McManus. I am the Planning and Rules Manager for the Air Division of the Department of Environmental Services. This is an informational webinar for the draft rule for Env-A 1400, regulated toxic air pollutants. We're going to wait a few more minutes for attendees to join in. We have probably just over half of everyone who is registered is online right now. So we're just going to wait probably 5 more minutes to start the meat of this. But as you can see from the slide on the screen, a copy of the informational rule can be found at https://www.des.nh.gov/documents/enva 1400-draft.pdf. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email Margaret King at margaret.m.king@des.nh.gov. And Margaret is spelled M-A-R-G-A-R-E-T in case you are on your phone only and can't see the screen. She can also be phoned at 603-271-6893. And again, I'm going to wait until about 9:35 till we start the presentation. Presenting the main part of this presentation will be Pat North, who's our technical lead on this rule. Also with us today is Todd Moore, Dave Larson, and Barbara Dorschmidt will be taking questions. So again, this is for the informational webinar on the draft rule of Env-A 1400. We're going to wait 2 more minutes till about 9:35 to start the presentation so we can have everyone online. A copy of the informational rule can be found at the address on your screen. If you have technical difficulties, you can email Margaret M. King. All right, I guess we're going to start. It's 9:35. Good morning. Again, I'm Carla McManus, the Planning and Rules Manager for the Air Resources Division of the Department of Environmental Services. Today we are doing the Stakeholder Informational webinar on the draft rule of Env-A 1400, Regulated Toxic Air Pollutants. This is just informational. It's not a formal rulemaking process where we won't be getting into the formal process for at least another 6 months. At that time, there will be public notice, public hearing, public comments. Right now, this is just informational about the changes we are proposing at this time. A copy of the informational rule can be found at the link you see on your screen. If you have technical difficulties, please email margaret.m.king@des.nh.gov. Phone number, 271-6893. Next slide. So today is September 8th. We are starting the webinar at 9:36 a.m. All participants have been muted upon entry, and this webinar is being recorded. This recording will be available on the DES website under What's New in a few days. It will include the slides as well as the verbal part of this recording. So keep an eye out for that. Let's see. If you're joining via telephone, you're not going to be able to speak, only listen, but you can email questions to Pat North after the presentation is over at patricia.r.north@des.nh.gov. Today with us, in addition to me starting off the hearing, we have Pat North, who will be doing the main part of the presentation. Then we also have Todd Moore, Dave Larson, and Barbara Dorschmidt, who will be organizing the questions and reading them out loud later. We will also be taking a break, excuse me, after about an hour, about a 5-minute, 10-minute break, so people can use the facilities, and then we'll come back online. Next slide. At certain points during this webinar, we will stop for questions. Please enter your questions as we're going along, as you think of them, because Barbara Dorschmidt will be taking them in and organizing them, and we will be reading them out during the question period. Pat will be funneling the questions to the appropriate panelist, excuse me, whether that's Todd Moore, Dave Larson, or Barbara Dorschmidt. And now I'd like to introduce Pat North, from the technical lead from the Air Resources Division. Next slide.
Good morning and welcome to the Stakeholder Informational webinar. Today I'll be taking you through an overview of the proposed changes to Env-A 1400 Regulated Toxic Air Pollutants. With today's presentation, I hope to clarify the reasoning behind many of the proposed changes to the rule. There will be several opportunities during the presentation to ask questions, and as Carla mentioned, the question box will be available throughout this presentation. Oops. As most of you know, Env-A 1400 has its basis in statute, specifically RSA 125I, the Air Toxics Control Act. This statute was enacted in 1987 and amended by the legislature in 1996. I've divided the presentation into 4 sections: rule housekeeping, new definitions, changes to rule language, and lastly, changes to table 1450-1, which is the RTAP table. The first section is rule housekeeping, which consists mostly of tidying up the rule language. These changes are done mainly for consistency across the rule and includes the consistent use of the RTAP and AAL acronyms within the rule language, and corrections of cross-references to other rules. For example, in ENV-A 1402.02b, which is the exemption for gasoline dispensing and storage facilities, ENV-WM 1404 has been corrected to ENV-OR 500. We've also added units of measure to the equations in the method of demonstrating compliance section. We're also standardizing the number of significant figures for the AALs and de minimis levels in table 1450-1 so that any number less than or equal to 10 will be rounded to two significant figures. And this is an example of how we're going to be rounding. The rounding rules that we're using are from the 2009 EPA guidance document titled Issuance of the Clean Air Act National Stack Testing Guidance. If you'd like a copy of this document, please email me and I can send one along to you. So on to the next section, which is new definitions. We've added several new definitions to ENV-A 1401.03 based on past clarification questions received from sources. The first set of definitions are for the particulate fraction distinctions used in the RTAP table 1450-1. Given we often receive questions as to what those notations mean, we have added these to eliminate confusion and have everyone on the same page when performing an RTAP review. We are adding the definitions of inhalable fraction in vapor, respirable fraction, and thoracic particulate matter. These definitions were taken directly from the ACGIH handbook, which is the basis for the RTAP AALs. Another important definition we're proposing to add is the definition of uncontrolled emission. This definition has been taken directly from the statute RSA 125I:2, section 17. And it means any emission of a regulated toxic air pollutant from a device or process at a stationary source that is not subject to treatment or removal by pollution control equipment prior to being emitted to the ambient air, or is emitted to the ambient air in amounts which have not been limited by conditions in an enforceable permit or document. The important thing here is this is not potential. This language differs from the EPA definition of potential, and we didn't want to cause any confusion. So you can see that in 1400, you are not allowed to take any permit limits into consideration when you're calculating your emissions. However, EPA's definition of potential allows a source to take those federally enforceable limits into account when calculating potential. So, questions? Barbara, do we have any questions so far?
Yes, there was one question on definitions. I'm not sure if it's a question or just a comment. The person said, define on page 2.3, I'm assuming that means that the proposed rule, used oil heaters. Do we have a definition of used oil heaters?
Oh, okay. Used oil heaters, that's in the exemptions from applicability. A used oil heater is generally something that's found in a lot of garages. Auto shops use them for space heat in the wintertime. They will take the used motor oil and use those devices for area heat. So that's what a used oil heater is.
One person, I don't know if you'll get to this later on in your presentation, you probably will, but somebody asked for a link to the EPA guidance on rounding rules.
Yeah, I can, if you, Barbara, if you save that question, I can email a PDF copy of the document to them if they would like that.
Okay. Yeah, all the questions I believe are saved with the recording, so we will be able to refer back to them if we need to get back to people.
Okay.
Another question, if a filter is fixed to equipment and returns captured particles to a storage bin, can that be considered part of the equipment and not control device?
Pat, this is Todd. I can take that one.
Okay.
You mentioned I'd be on here. This is Todd Moore. I work in the permitting section for air resources, and that's a question that it goes beyond 1400, essentially asking whether something that whether or not it's a piece of pollution control equipment, and it's really a case-by-case determination. But those concepts that were mentioned in the question are the information we would need. You know, the purpose of the device to collect product, or is it to remove air pollutants? So it's I can't answer that as a blanket, but it's that concept is used in some things. I think a wood pellet plant, for example, where they have a device that takes the sawdust out of the airstream because they want to collect the sawdust because that is the material that they're using to make their product. In that case, I believe there was a determination that it was not pollution control equipment. So I'd say the answer is it depends, and it's case by case.
Okay, I just want to let people know that after I ask their question out loud, I'm going to respond to them with a thank you for your question, just to help keep track of what's been answered and asked. So if anybody did not get an appropriate answer, they can ask it in a different format. But at this point, we have no other questions.
Okay. So let's move on to section 3, changes to rule language. This is how the rule currently flows, beginning with what the results of a compliance demonstration means for your facility, the process to apply for a permit if you need one, and then how to demonstrate compliance. This is kind of putting the cart before the horse, telling you what you need to do before you even know you have to do it. So we're proposing to reorder certain sections of the rule so we can get a more logical flow for the rule requirements, streamline the rule to eliminate redundant and confusing language, and to better help define expectations. So for example, instead of stating when you don't need a permit changed to when you do need a permit. And in order to do that, we're reorganizing and renumbering certain sections, as noted on this slide. So this rearranging and renumbering leads to this. Now the rule will define what your compliance obligations are, how you demonstrate compliance, what the results of the demonstration means for your facility, and the process you must follow to apply for a permit or permit modification if you need one. So let's go through these revised sections. The first one is section 1403, compliance standards. And it's a new section in the proposed rule and has been added to better define what's expected of each source that's subject to the rule. This section spells out clear expectations that the source must manage their RTAP emissions, remain in compliance with the AALs, and demonstrate compliance. Now, sections 1404.01 through Env-A 1404.05 don't have any major language changes proposed. The only changes we are proposing are minor housekeeping changes, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which consist of using consistent RTAP and AAL acronyms, correction to cross-reference rules, and the units of measure added to the equations in 1404.04, which is the methods of compliance. So ENV-A 1404.06, we're proposing several language changes, such as changing request to proposal. We've also added section B4 to emphasize that for any alternative method proposed, the source must still demonstrate compliance with the AALs. This is not present in the current rule, although it is mandated in RSA 125I. We've also have a new subsection B in ENV-A 1404.07, which contains language to clarify compliance boundaries. Under the new subsection B, the language stipulates that an owner or operator cannot include property they lease to another as being within their compliance boundary. For example, Company A owns all the property within the larger purple board outline. They lease a building and some land on their property to Company B. Company A is conducting a compliance demonstration for a new RTAP that they'll be emitting, and they need to perform ambient air impact modeling. Because Company A has leased an area of their property to Company B, the property they now lease to Company B is beyond their compliance boundary. So Company A must exclude that property leased to Company B in their ambient modeling. We're also proposing a new subsection C under ENV-A 1404.07, which is alternative compliance boundary. This language states how a source would go about requesting an alternative compliance boundary. The request must be in writing, and the information required for the request is listed in the proposed rule language. The source must still comply with the AALs at and beyond the alternative boundary. And DES will make a decision whether or not to accept an alternative boundary within 60 days of request of a completed application. So now for questions.
I just realized I was not unmuted, but we have one question. Does the property under control of the applicant need to be fenced, or is ownership and control sufficient? You want me to repeat that?
Yes.
Does the property under control of the applicant need to be fenced, or is ownership and control sufficient?
The property does not need to be fenced. Company B, the lease agreement between Company A and Company B would normally specify what Company B is leasing. So in other words, it might just be the building, or it might be the building and certain amount of parking spaces, or it might be the building and a certain amount of property around the building. So it does not need to be fenced off.
Okay, somebody asked if you could provide an example of an alternative compliance boundary.
No, because we haven't gotten one yet.
Okay. Todd, do you have anything to add to that?
This thing, I this may be out of date, but I recall possibly an alternative compliance boundary where a facility was allowed to extend their compliance boundary, meaning they were allowed to have impacts over the AAL over an abutting water body, where their property line stopped at, say, the shoreline, but they demonstrated that it was acceptable to have, extend their compliance boundary into the water body. I'm not saying that that's a, carte blanche applies to all situations, but that would be an example of where somebody pushed their compliance boundary further out than the property that they owned and controlled.
Okay, next question. Would a source have to remodel if previous compliance demonstrations use property boundaries as the compliance boundary without accounting for the least portion of the property? It says, or is this change only forward looking? Would you like me to repeat that?
Yes.
Okay. Would a source have to remodel if previous compliance demonstrations use property boundaries as the compliance boundary without accounting for the least portion of the property? Or is this change only forward looking? I'm assuming they're thinking, is this only for new sources?
Well, if there was a change to an AAL that, say they modeled for compound X at AAL of 10, the AAL is now 8, and they need to remodel. When they remodel, they would need to exclude the least property.
But they wouldn't
And
have to remodel for their current situation?
This is Todd. I think, Pat mentioned, if the AAL changes, there are provisions in the rules on how sources come up to speed with the new AAL. But that's a good point relative to if the source is not changing anything and we're not changing AALs, but this rule as proposed changes the compliance boundary for a particular source, say they're leasing something out. As written, there is no transition, but that's a point that we will consider. And if anybody on this call has suggestions on how to address that, definitely email them to Pat. But as written, it would take effect, if the rule was finalized as the draft that we're looking at, it would be effective immediately.
Okay, next question. Would property offset by town impact property? Or impact, I'm sorry, let me repeat that. Would property offset by town impact boundary?
I don't understand that question.
Pat, I think I can take this one as well, and the answer is no. There's no criteria or provisions relative to town ordinances, setbacks, or anything like that. We defer to the definition of compliance boundary. I think that's ownership and control.
Okay, next question. This is, I think, a follow-up to the alternative compliance boundary. Would an alternative compliance boundary be a forested area where frequent human use does not occur? They're thinking, would that be an example?
This is Todd. I can take that one as well. Alternative compliance boundaries, there are provisions in the rules whereby a source could submit information to DES and the criteria and the rules. So it's not something that we would be able to address during this webinar or even in a phone call. If the source could demonstrate that they meet the criteria for a compliance boundary, it's possible, but there's no canned description relative to forest area, ordinances, or anything like that.
Okay, next one seems like a long question. So, should there be air monitoring of a source's emissions if the source flows over a water body for compliance of the property boundary? For example, PFAS emissions over the Merrimack River when using newer PFAS compounds. You want me to repeat that?
Yes.
Should there be air monitoring of a source's emissions if the source flows over a water body for compliance of the property boundary? So they're asking if air monitoring should be used if somebody is saying there's a water body for their property boundary.
And this is Todd. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but Chapter 1400 does not require specifically any sort of air monitoring. It requires that the source know or had sufficient information, just like any other air pollution regulation. The source knows what its emissions are, so it can be compared against the standards. But beyond that, it's either probably a more complex question that I think we can address right now.
Okay, another long question. In the event compliance with a revised AAL can't be demonstrated without an expensive reconstruction project at the facility, for example, adding an emission control device and increasing a stack height, is there a backed-like provision for evaluating economic feasibility? Would you like me to repeat that?
Yeah, well, no, I'm thinking that the statute does allow for, now there are two things that can be done. The source can petition us to change the AAL, which there is, I can't remember which section it is in the rule, but there is a section in the rule to change, if someone wants to petition us to change an AAL, they can petition us to change an AAL or add or remove a compound. Also in the AAL, in the statute, I don't know exactly where, but there is the ability to take into account economic and other factors, and I can't I can't find where it is in the rule, but I can get back to that person after the webinar and address their question.
Hi, Pat, this is Carla. I found the part in the rule that talks about petitioning for modification to the RTAP list.
Yep.
It's ENVA 1412, in case people want to look it up.
Okay, I have no other questions at this time.
Okay, so this brings us to the last part of the major proposed language changes section. And the first major change is language in ENVA 1405.02, and it's been condensed and clarified to specify that if the RTAP emissions meet the listed conditions, a permit is not required. This is where the definition of uncontrolled emission in 140103 becomes important. Subsection A1 is for an uncontrolled emissions, which are calculated based on 8760 hours of operation at maximum production capacity. And again, this is potential for 1400, not the potential based on the EPA definition. So you have to make sure that you're thinking 1400 when you're calculating your uncontrolled. So 1405.02, we added a section A2, which speaks to uncontrolled actual and the requirements that must be met to be exempt from permitting. These requirements are the same as in the current rule, but they're condensed for easier understanding. And now 1405.03 is a new subsection and has been added to specify how a source would go about obtaining a permit. 1405.04 was added to define the requirements that are in place when the department revises the RTAP list, what the obligations of the source are, and the timing of those requirements. In other words, the source has 90 days from when the changes to 1400 are adopted to submit an application for a permit or an application for a permit amendment. So moving on to section 1406, application procedures. The revised language in ENVA 1406.01a states that a source must now include the operating conditions that are needed to comply with the AALs. ENVA 1406.02b includes language stating that if the department revises the RTAP list and an existing source needs a permit or modification due to those AAL changes, they must include a compliance plan with the application. And the information required to be included in the compliance plan is also listed in this section. The conditions that are included in the compliance plan will be included in the permit. So, questions?
Pat, I have a comment. This is Carla McManus. I just have a little clarification to add. In the revision of the list rule, it's actually the source has 90 days, not from the effective date of the rule, but from the publication of the final revision in the rulemaking register, which is sometimes, it's usually after the effective date of the rule. It doesn't always coincide, just so people know.
Okay. I don't have any questions at this time, but I thought I would mention that I received an email from our administrator, Gary Milbury, who's listening in on the call but doesn't have access to speak, about the economics of AAL changes. He says economics are only considered with respect to how long they have to comply with AAL changes. And it is in the statute 125-I-5, where basically when they have to develop this compliance plan for achieving compliance with the new AAL, they can take into account economic considerations in developing their schedule for when they will need to comply. So just wanted to follow up on that. And then we did receive a question as I was talking. Under 1405 rule, are any prior permitted pollutants grandfathered when either a change of the emission sources, when either a change of the emission sources formulation by using a newer chemical or PFAS? Sorry. You want me to repeat that?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just reading it as written. Under 1405 rule, are any prior permitted pollutants grandfathered when there's either a change of the emission sources formulation by using a newer chemical or PFAS?
Todd, do you understand what they're asking?
I think I understand. And in essence, 1400 does not provide for any grandfathering. If a source changes their operations and emits a new pollutant or changes the emission levels of an existing pollutant, they must still demonstrate compliance with the current list of regulated pollutants in the current AALs. If the state changes the rule and changes an AAL for a pollutant, then we get into what Pat was just describing, where an existing source may have up to 3 years to come into compliance with the new revised AAL. But at the end of that 3 years, they need to be in compliance. So there's no grandfathering per se.
That is all the questions I have at this point.
Okay, so let's proceed to the last section of the presentation, and the one that everyone's probably most interested in, the table of all regulated toxic air pollutants. So this year, we reviewed the entire RTAP list in table 1450-1 to confirm CAS numbers, to make sure the spelling of chemical names are correct, and to confirm that the AALs and de minimis levels listed in the rule match those that are in the ARD RTAP database. The database is used by DES to calculate and track changes to the OALs and reference concentrations that are used to calculate the AAL and de minimis levels for all the RTAPs. This rulemaking will also include updates and changes made by ACGIH in 2017, 2018, and 2019. So overall, there are 18 new chemicals that are proposed to be added because they were added by ACGIH. 20 RTAPs have been removed from the list for a variety of reasons, ranging from some being herbicides, which are regulated by the Department of Agriculture, to changes in a chemical class, such as chromium compounds. Changes are also proposed to 37 AALs due to adjustments to an OEL by ACGIH or changes in the IRIS reference concentrations made by US EPA. There are 86 corrections to chemical names, which include the addition of particulate fraction designations such as inhalable fraction or inhalable fraction and vapor. And there are 103 new chemicals to be added. The majority of these additional compounds are added because they belong to various chemical classes, which are listed in the ACGIH supporting documentation for the parent compound. For example, barium and beryllium and compounds as beryllium inhalable fraction. The supporting documentation also lists the 3 beryllium oxide, beryllium fluoride, and beryllium hydroxide. So they have been added to the list. Now the reader would be referred back to beryllium compounds as beryllium inhalable fraction. For example, beryllium oxide as beryllium. It says see beryllium and compounds as beryllium inhalable fraction CAS number 7440-41-7. So that you would have to go back to beryllium at 7440-417 and look for the AAL and de minimis levels there. Now, of one particular interest on the changes is formaldehyde. If you'll notice, both the annual and the 24-hour AALs have changed, and this was due to a decrease in the ACGIH OEL from 0.3 ppm to 0.1 ppm. The AAL decreases proposed for methyl vinyl ketone, furfuryl alcohol, zinc oxide, nickel insoluble are also due to changes in ACGIH OEL decreases. If you'll notice, the 24-hour and annual AAL and 24-hour AALs have decreased for hydrogen sulfide by an order of magnitude. This is due to the correction of a decimal place error found during the comprehensive review process that we conducted. The decrease in beryllium AALs are due to the establishment of an OEL by ACGIH. The previous AAL was based on a reference concentration from EPA's IRIS. The AAL changes for fluoride, fluorine as F, and chlorine and chromochloride are all due to OEL decreases made by ACGIH. So now we'll take questions.
I have one question that goes back to compliance demonstrations. Under 1405.02, why, if using the in-stack concentration method, are concentrations based on actual emissions compared to the AALs not 50% of the AALs as in paragraph C?
I think this is more of a permitting question, Pat, so I can take this one. The section 1405 is not compliance demonstration. It is the criteria that you walk through to determine whether or not a permit is required for the facility. So, and they're asking about the difference in, I believe, 1405.02A 1 and 2.
I'm not sure exactly the rule references. It just says why, if using the in-stack concentration method, are concentrations based on actual emissions compared to the AALs not 50% of the AALs.
Yeah, I guess I would have to take that question and walk through the rule to make sure I understand it, so I can't answer it at the moment. But I just want to make a point that that section of the rule is not how you demonstrate compliance with the AALs. It's where you determine whether or not you need a permit relative to 1400. Beyond that, I guess we'll have that question. We can look at it in more detail and hopefully have the contact information for the person who asked the question.
I believe, yeah, we have the contact information for people to ask questions. I have a couple of questions. People asked about some of the acronyms you use. Pat, what is ACGIH?
ACGIH is the American Council of Governmental and Industrial Hygienists.
And then what is EPA ISIS?
IRIS is the Integrated Risk Information System.
Okay, thank you. Was only 1 decimal point error found in review of the table?
I don't remember. I mean, there are a lot of changes, and I can't, off the top of my head, I can't say.
Should we? Okay. Let's see. Are ALs for quote and compounds, RTAPs, considered on a collective basis? So in other words, if a facility emits beryllium oxide and beryllium hydroxide, should the emissions of both beryllium compounds be added before comparing to the ALs?
Yes.
Okay. Somebody asked if there is any change in dioxin furan standards as a result of this review.
No.
Okay. That is it for questions at this moment. Oh, nope. We just got one in. In the future, will New Hampshire DES look to place all the PFAS compounds under a separate heading and as a family? There are too many now listed to list.
I'm not sure how many PFAS compounds are even listed in table 1450. I think there was only one, and I don't remember if it was a breakdown product or if it was a precursor. But we haven't, and this is not this, 1400 is not the same as the water regulations, so you need to remember that this is only air. So, and I can't say whether we will or not.
Yeah, the same questioner just wrote, there are more than 4,700 variations listed by the manufacturers of PFAS compounds. So I guess he's wondering in the future if DS is going, I guess, add any PFAS compounds or do it as a family.
And I can't tell the future. I don't know.
Okay.
Currently, if it's listed in EPA IRIS, or if it's listed in ACGIH, we go through, Dave Larson goes through the risk calculations and determines whether it goes on the list or not.
So this is Carla McManus. I'm adding on to what Pat said. Obviously, if it goes through ACGIH or IRIS, it will be in the 1400 table. But at some point down the line, the Air Division is going to be adopting some PFAS rules of their own. So
I have an email from Gary Milbury that says we currently just have one APFO. We would establish new ones as ACGIH would establish PFAS standards as a group, but not sure, what the future is going to hold. At this point, I have no other questions.
Okay.
okay, so
So
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Carla.
This is Carla McManus. We are wrapping up the hearing today. It was an informational hearing on the draft rule of ENV-A 1400. If you have any questions on the substance of the proposed rule, you can email patricia.r.north@des.nh.gov. If you have any questions on the rulemaking process, you can email me at carla.s.mcmanus@des.nh.gov. I'd like to add that the formal rulemaking process probably won't start for another 6 months. In that process, we start with a hearing by the Air Resources Council on the proposed rule. And then we move on to a public hearing and comment period. And the last step is a hearing by the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. But between now and then, we are going to take into account comments we've received today and possibly add some clarifications. Once the formal rulemaking process starts, the notice of public hearing will be sent out through our constant contact list. And the way to sign up for that, if you haven't already, next slide, please, is you go to our DES front page, see the arrow pointing at subscribe to e-news. So you click on that, next page, and then you fill out your email address, first name, last name, etc., and click on New Hampshire Air Rulemaking Notices. From there, you will be informed about all air rules whenever we have a public hearing. So again, thank you for coming. And
Carla, I'm sorry.
sure.
I've been monitoring questions and I wasn't paying attention to what you were saying. Somebody
Sure.
asked when we think the rule will be finalized. You might have already said it, but.
The formal process probably won't start until maybe January, and it takes at least 6 months to go through the whole process. So possibly finalized by next summer of 2021.
Okay. I don't have any other questions at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming.